The photograph sat on Helen Carmichael's nightstand for 37 years before she finally understood what she was looking at. It was a wedding photo, herself at 26, radiant in ivory satin and Belgian lace, standing beside Daniel, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. She'd always attributed his expression to wedding day jitters, to the natural nervousness of a man taking such a serious step. But now, at 63 years old, with reading glasses perched on her nose, and the truth finally laid bare like a dissected specimen, Helen could see what had always been there. Daniel's eyes weren't looking at her. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking past both, toward the best man standing 3 feet to the left, toward Michael. Helen had spent 4 years married to a ghost, 4 years sleeping beside a man who treated the space between them like a demilitarized zone, an invisible barrier that could not be crossed without triggering some unspoken catastrophe. 4 years of wondering what was wrong with her, what deficiency in her body or spirit made her so fundamentally untouchable. The truth, when it finally detonated in her carefully constructed life, didn't come as a relief. It came as a retroactive theft. Someone had stolen her youth, her innocence, her chance at real love, and she hadn't even known it was happening until it was far too late to get those years back. The story began in 1982 in the small Pennsylvania town of Millbrook, where the steel mill still belched smoke into gray skies, and Sunday church attendance was the social currency that determined your worth. Helen worked as a secretary at the town's only insurance agency, a job that paid modestly but offered the respectability her mother, Patricia, valued above all else. Patricia Brennan was a widow who'd raised 3 daughters on a seamstress's salary and sheer force of will. She taught Helen that a woman's virtue was her treasure, to be guarded zealously and given only to a husband under God's blessing. Helen had absorbed this teaching completely, building her entire identity around the idea that she was saving herself for something sacred, something worth the waiting. Daniel Carmichael arrived in Millbrook that spring like an answer to a prayer Helen hadn't known she'd been praying. He was 30 years old, educated, employed as an accountant at the mill's corporate office, and most importantly, he attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday without fail. He had dark hair that he kept meticulously combed, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly air, and a quiet, reserved manner that Helen mistook for depth. Her mother approved of him immediately. "He's serious," Patricia would say, watching Daniel from across the church fellowship hall. "He's not like these other boys who only want one thing. He's a gentleman." The courtship followed all the proper protocols. Daniel asked Helen's mother for permission to take her to dinner. He chose respectable restaurants with white tablecloths and older clientele. He never tried to touch her beyond a chaste handhold or a brief, dry kiss goodnight on her mother's front porch. Helen found his restraint reassuring at first. Here was a man who respected her, who saw her as more than a body. Here was a man who understood that real love was built on shared values and mutual respect, not on the cheap thrills that led so many couples into hasty, regret-filled marriages. But even in those early months, there were fractures in the facade that Helen's desperate hope papered over. Daniel would stiffen when she hugged him, his body going rigid as if she'd startled him from sleep. When they went to the movies, he sat with his arms crossed, never reaching for her hand in the darkness. He talked endlessly about his best friend from college, Michael, who lived in Philadelphia and worked in finance. Michael was brilliant. Michael was funny. Michael understood him in a way no one else did. Helen had been pleased that Daniel had such a close friendship. She thought it spoke well of his capacity for loyalty and emotional depth. The proposal came after 8 months of dating. It happened at the town park, under the gazebo, where couples had been getting engaged for 3 generations. Daniel got down on one knee with a small diamond ring and asked Helen to be his wife in a voice that trembled not with passion, but with something else, something that sounded, if she'd been listening carefully, almost like resignation. Helen said yes with her whole heart. At 26, she'd begun to worry that she was aging out of desirability, that her insistence on virtue was pricing her out of the marriage market. Daniel was her salvation, her proof that waiting for the right man paid off. The engagement period was 6 months of frantic preparation. Helen and her mother sewed the wedding dress by hand, cream-colored satin with pearl buttons down the back. They addressed invitations, planned the reception menu, and decorated the church fellowship hall with white roses and baby's breath. Through it all, Daniel remained curiously detached. He let Helen make every decision, showing no preference about flowers or music or cake flavors. When she tried to discuss their honeymoon plans, a modest 3 days at a cabin in the Poconos, he would change the subject or suddenly remember an urgent errand. Helen told herself he was just overwhelmed, that men didn't care about wedding details the way women did. But there were other signs, clearer signs, that her desperation to believe in the fairy tale kept her from seeing. Michael visited from Philadelphia twice during the engagement. Both times, Daniel transformed. He became animated, laughing freely, touching Michael's arm when making a point, casual, easy touches he never offered Helen. They would disappear for hours, claiming they were catching up or going for drives to see Daniel's favorite spots from his childhood. Helen had been glad Daniel had such a good friend. She'd even mentioned to her mother how wonderful it would be if Michael could find a nice girl to settle down with too. Maybe they could have children at the same time, grow old as couples who took vacations together. The wedding day was October 16th, 1982. The leaves were at peak color, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke and dying summer. Helen walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm, her heart pounding with anticipation and joy. This was it. This was the moment her whole life had been building toward. She looked at Daniel waiting at the altar, and for just a second, she saw something flash across his face. Was it panic? Fear? But then he smiled, a tight, controlled smile, and she dismissed it as wedding jitters. They were pronounced husband and wife. The kiss was brief, so brief that several guests later commented that they'd barely seen it happen. The reception was a blur of cake and dancing and well wishes. Helen danced with Daniel to their chosen song, Endless Love by Diana Ross and Lionel Richie. But Daniel held her at arm's length, his hand barely touching her waist, moving mechanically through the steps they'd practiced. Michael, the best man, gave a toast that went on too long, talking about Daniel's loyalty and kindness and the depth of their friendship in a voice that cracked with emotion. People dabbed at their eyes, moved by the bond between the two friends. Helen had been touched too, grateful that Daniel had someone who loved him so deeply. They drove to the cabin in Daniel's sedan, Helen still in her wedding dress, her veil folded carefully in a box in the back seat. The cabin was rustic but clean, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking a lake. Daniel carried their suitcases inside, then immediately busied himself building a fire, even though the evening was mild. Helen went to the bedroom and changed into the white nightgown she'd purchased for this moment, silk and lace, modest but feminine. She brushed her hair until it shone. She waited. Daniel didn't come to the bedroom. She found him sitting on the couch, staring into the fire, still fully dressed. "Helen," he'd said when she sat beside him, "I'm exhausted. The stress of the wedding, the drive, all the people. Can we just rest tonight? We have our whole lives ahead of us." Helen had been disappointed, but understanding. Of course, he was tired. She was tired too. They slept in the same bed that night, but Daniel stayed on his side, his back to her, his body curved away as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Helen lay awake for hours, listening to his breathing, telling herself that tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow wasn't different. Daniel woke early, suggested they go for a hike, filled the day with activities that kept them moving, kept them from being alone and intimate. That night, he claimed a headache. The third night, he said his back was bothering him from sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress. They returned to Millbrook after 3 days, and Helen was still a virgin, still untouched, still waiting for her marriage to actually begin. They moved into a small house on Maple Street, a 2-bedroom rental with a tidy yard and neighbors who waved from their porches. Helen threw herself into making it a home. She cooked elaborate meals, kept the house spotless, planted flowers in the window boxes. She was determined to be the perfect wife, convinced that if she could just create the environment, Daniel would finally reach for her. But every night, He found a reason to avoid the bedroom. He worked late. He was too stressed. He had a project deadline. When Helen finally gathered the courage to initiate physical contact herself, reaching for him in bed, trying to kiss him with more passion than their usual quick pecks, he would gently but firmly extricate himself. "I'm sorry," he'd say, looking genuinely tormented. "I'm just not feeling well. It's not you." But Helen knew, in the way women know things they can't quite articulate, that it was her. Something about her was fundamentally undesirable. She began a desperate campaign of self-improvement. She bought magazines about how to be more attractive to your husband. She changed her hairstyle. She bought new clothes. She lost weight until her mother expressed concern. Nothing worked. Daniel remained polite, pleasant, and completely unavailable. 6 months into the marriage, Helen's mother sat her down with worried eyes. "Have you been to the doctor?" she asked delicately. "Is there a reason you're not expecting?" Helen had lied, saying they were waiting. They wanted to be more financially stable first. But her mother's question planted a seed of panic. If she couldn't even get Daniel to consummate their marriage, how would she ever have children? She was 27 years old. Time was passing, and she was trapped in a marriage that existed only on paper. It was around this time that Daniel started making weekend trips to Philadelphia. "Michael needs help with something," he'd explain. "Work crisis, family emergency, apartment problems." He'd leave Friday evening and return Sunday night, often looking more relaxed and energized than he ever did at home. Helen was too consumed with her own perceived failures to question it. She spent those weekends alone, cleaning an already clean house, cooking meals for one, and crying into her pillow. The breaking point came at the end of their first year of marriage. Helen had gone to see Dr. Morrison, the family physician who'd known her since childhood. She'd confessed everything: the lack of intimacy, the constant rejections, her fear that something was medically wrong with her that repulsed Daniel. Dr. Morrison, a kind man in his 60s, had examined her and found her perfectly healthy. Then he'd asked a question that changed everything. "Mrs. Carmichael, has your husband been examined? Has he seen a doctor about this issue?" Helen had been stunned. She'd never considered that Daniel might be the one with a problem. She'd been so conditioned to see herself as the issue that it hadn't occurred to her that the problem might lie elsewhere. Dr. Morrison had suggested gently that Daniel should be evaluated, that there could be physical or psychological issues at play that had nothing to do with Helen's attractiveness or worth as a wife. That evening, Helen had approached Daniel with this new information, expecting him to be relieved that there might be a medical explanation. Instead, he'd become defensive, angry even. "There's nothing wrong with me," he'd snapped. "Maybe the problem is that you're too demanding. Maybe if you stopped pressuring me, stopped making me feel inadequate, I could relax. Can't you see how stressful this is for me?" Helen had apologized, had taken on the guilt he was offering, promised to be more patient. But something had cracked open in her mind. For the first time, she'd allowed herself to be angry. She'd spent a year blaming herself, contorting herself into smaller and smaller shapes to accommodate his comfort, and he was calling her demanding. She, who'd never once raised her voice or issued an ultimatum, the truth began to reveal itself in small, terrible increments. Helen started paying closer attention. She noticed that the phone would ring, and Daniel would answer it in the kitchen, his voice dropping to a whisper. Once, when she picked up the extension in the bedroom without realizing he was on the line, she heard Michael's voice, warm and intimate in a way Daniel's voice never was with her. "I miss you," Michael was saying. "When can you come back?" Daniel had heard the click of Helen picking up and had barked at her to hang up, that this was a private call. She noticed the receipts. Daniel was meticulous about finances, keeping every receipt filed neatly in a box. Helen had been looking for the receipt from the pharmacy to file their insurance when she found restaurant receipts from Philadelphia, expensive places, 2 meals ordered, wine. She found hotel receipts. The Plaza Hotel in Philadelphia, Friday and Saturday nights. Why would Daniel need a hotel room if he was staying with Michael? Unless the hotel room was the point. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Helen's brain kept offering innocent explanations. Maybe Michael lived in a small apartment and the hotel was more comfortable. Maybe the restaurant was a business meeting, but the receipts kept appearing and the weekend trips kept happening. And Daniel kept treating Helen like a roommate he barely tolerated. The final proof came on a Saturday in October, just past their 2nd anniversary. Daniel had gone to Philadelphia again, claiming Michael needed help moving furniture. Helen had planned to spend the day cleaning out closets, but her mother called and asked her to come to lunch. They'd had a lovely meal, and afterward, Patricia had given Helen an early Christmas gift, a beautiful leather photo album. "Go through those boxes of photos you've been meaning to organize," her mother urged. "Make a record of your married life." Helen had gone home and pulled out the boxes of photographs from the wedding and the year that followed. She'd been sitting at the dining room table, arranging pictures, when she noticed something strange. In every wedding photo where Daniel was with Michael, there was a particular quality to the way they looked at each other. It wasn't the way male friends looked at each other. It was the way Helen had looked at Daniel when she thought she was in love with him, a softness, a longing, an intimacy that transcended friendship. She found a picture from Daniel's bachelor party that someone had left in the box. Daniel and Michael standing close, Daniel's arm around Michael's shoulders in a way that seemed less like a buddy pose and more like an embrace. Their faces were close together, and the look in Daniel's eyes, Helen had never seen him look at her that way. Not once. It was adoration. It was love. The room tilted. Helen put her head between her knees, fighting nausea. No, it couldn't be. Men like that didn't exist in Millbrook, didn't go to church, didn't get married. Except they did, she realized with dawning horror. They got married to hide. They got married to appear normal. They got married to women like her. Women who were so desperate to believe in the dream that they'd ignore every red flag until they were buried under them. Helen stood up on shaking legs and walked to the bedroom. She opened Daniel's side of the closet and began searching. At first, she found nothing unusual. But then, in a shoebox on the top shelf, hidden behind winter sweaters, she found letters, dozens of letters in Michael's handwriting, spanning years. Some were dated from before Daniel had even moved to Millbrook. "My darling Daniel," they began. "My love, my heart." Helen read them all, sitting on the bedroom floor, tears streaming down her face. They were love letters, explicit and passionate, detailing a relationship that had begun in college and never ended. They talked about stolen weekends, about the agony of separation, about the necessity of Daniel's marriage as protective cover. "I know you have to do this," one letter read. "I know small towns are unforgiving, and you need to protect your career. I'll wait for you. I'll always wait for you. Come to me when you can. I'll take whatever pieces of your life I can have." Helen was still sitting there, surrounded by letters, when Daniel came home Sunday evening. He walked into the bedroom and froze. The color drained from his face. Helen looked up at him, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt nothing. No love, no hope, not even anger. Just a vast, empty exhaustion. "You used me," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "You married me to hide, to cover up what you really are." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape route. Finally, he collapsed onto the bed, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Helen, I'm so sorry." The confession spilled out of him like poison from a wound. He told her everything. How he'd known since adolescence that he was different, that he was drawn to men in ways that terrified him. How he'd tried to pray it away, to fight it, to starve it out of existence. How he'd met Michael in college and fallen in love, but convinced himself it was a phase, a temptation to be resisted. How, when he moved to Millbrook for a fresh start, he decided that marriage to a good woman would cure him, would make him normal. He'd chosen Helen specifically because she was religious, virtuous, patient. He thought her goodness would somehow transform him. It didn't work, he said, weeping. Nothing changed. I still loved him. I tried, Helen. I tried to want you the way a husband should, but I couldn't, and I hated myself for it. I hated you for reminding me every day that I was broken. Helen sat there, watching this man she'd promised to love for a lifetime, and felt something inside her die. Not her love for him, that had been dead for months. It was her trust in the world, her belief that people were fundamentally honest. "You stole 2 years of my life," she said. "You stole my innocence. You let me think I was disgusting when the problem was that I was a woman. You let me pray to be more attractive to you when no amount of prayer would change what you are. I know, Daniel sobbed. I know. I'm a coward. I'm selfish. I wanted a normal life, and I used you to get it. Get out, Helen said. Her voice was steel. Pack your things and leave. Tonight. Helen, please get out. The scream tore from her throat, raw and primal. She stood up, grabbed the box of letters, and threw them at him. The letters scattered across the room like evidence at a crime scene. Go to Michael. Go to the person you actually love, and stop destroying me. Daniel left that night with 2 suitcases and the weight of his lies. Helen stood at the window and watched his car disappear down Maple Street, taillights fading into darkness. Then she collapsed on the floor and wept until there was nothing left inside her. The divorce was swift and brutal. In 1984, Pennsylvania didn't recognize irreconcilable differences easily, but Daniel didn't contest anything. He signed whatever papers Helen's lawyer put in front of him. He gave her the house, the car, half their meager savings. He didn't want a fight. He just wanted to escape to Philadelphia, to Michael, to the life he'd been living in secret all along. Millbrook was merciless. In a town that size, secrets were impossible. People speculated wildly about what had caused such a sudden divorce. Helen refused to tell the truth, partly because she feared judgment. What did it say about her that her husband preferred men? Partly because, even then, she understood that outing Daniel in 1984 in a small Pennsylvania steel town might literally get him killed. So she let people assume she was barren, or frigid, or had been hiding some terrible flaw. She absorbed the gossip and the pitying looks, and the way former friends suddenly had no time for her. Her mother stood by her, though Patricia didn't understand. She kept asking what had happened, why Helen wouldn't fight for her marriage, whether they'd tried counseling. Finally, Helen told her. She watched her mother's face go through shock, denial, and finally, a grim acceptance. That poor man, Patricia had said, and Helen had felt fury rise in her throat until she realized her mother meant her. You poor girl, what a burden to carry. Helen spent the next year in a fog. She moved back in with her mother temporarily, unable to bear the Maple Street house and its ghosts. She went to work, came home, and existed. She felt like a shell, hollow and breakable. She'd spent her entire life preparing to be a wife, and the one time she'd tried, she'd been cast in a play where she didn't even know her lines were fiction. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to rebuild. She started seeing Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who'd recently opened a practice in the neighboring town. Dr. Chen helped Helen untangle the web of shame and guilt she'd been caught in. You were a victim, Dr. Chen told her firmly. You didn't fail at marriage. You were deceived. Those are not the same thing. Helen began to understand that Daniel's sexuality wasn't a reflection of her worth. that his inability to desire her was about his truth, not her deficiency. It was a painful, slow education. She had to unlearn 27 years of conditioning that told her a woman's value came from being chosen by a man. She moved into a small apartment above the bakery downtown. She got a better job as an office manager at the hospital. She started taking night classes at the community college, literature, history, subjects that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. She cut her hair short. She bought pants even though her mother disapproved. She began, slowly, to become Helen, not Helen waiting to be chosen. It was at the community college, in a poetry class, that she met Richard. He was 52, a widower whose wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier. He had silver hair and kind eyes, and hands that bore the scars of a lifetime working construction. He was nothing like Daniel. Where Daniel had been reserved and controlled, Richard was open and expressive. Where Daniel had been cold, Richard was warm. He laughed loudly. He talked with his hands. He had no pretense, no performance. They became friends first. They'd get coffee after class and talk about T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost. Richard told her about his late wife, Margaret, with a tenderness that made Helen's heart ache. "She'd been everything to me," he said simply. "Losing her was like losing half my soul. But I have to believe she'd want me to keep living." Helen told Richard her story too. All of it. The marriage that wasn't a marriage. The years of blaming herself. The discovery of Daniel's secret life. She waited for Richard to pull away, to be disgusted or uncomfortable. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand. "That man was a fool," Richard said quietly, "not for being who he was. That's not a choice. But for lying to you, for wasting your time, for making you feel small when you're magnificent." Helen started to cry, something that had become embarrassingly common since the divorce. Richard moved around the table and held her while she sobbed in the corner of a community college cafeteria. When she finally pulled away, mortified, he just smiled and handed her a napkin. "First rule of friendship with me," he said. "I hug. Fair warning." The relationship that developed between Helen and Richard was nothing like what she'd had with Daniel. It was slow, careful, built on genuine friendship and respect. Richard didn't push her. He understood that trust had to be earned in increments. When he finally kissed her, 6 months after they'd met, it was tentative, asking permission. Helen kissed him back and felt something she'd never felt before wanted, not as a costume or a convenience, but as herself. Their first night together, Helen was terrified. She was 30 years old and still technically a virgin. She'd spent her entire 20s in a sexless marriage, and now she had no idea what she was doing. Richard had been patient, gentle, making her laugh when she got too nervous, stopping when she needed to stop, praising her when she couldn't quite believe she was doing this. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is the first time, but it was real. It was honest. And afterward, Richard had held her and told her she was beautiful, and Helen had believed him. They married in 1987, a small ceremony with just family and close friends. There were no illusions this time, no fairy tales. Just two people who'd been hurt by life, choosing to be gentle with each other. They built a life together in a modest house on the outskirts of Millbrook. They couldn't have children Helen's age, and Richard's vasectomy years earlier made that impossible. But they filled their home with other kinds of joy. Richard taught her to garden. Helen taught him to appreciate poetry. They traveled, argued, made up, and loved each other with a fierce pragmatism that came from understanding how rare it was to find genuine connection. Richard died of a heart attack in 2019, 25 years after they'd found each other. Helen held his hand as he slipped away, and even through her grief, she felt grateful. She'd had more real love in those 25 years than most people got in a lifetime. After Richard died, Helen found herself thinking about Daniel more than she had in decades. She'd heard through Millbrook's relentless gossip network that he was still in Philadelphia, still with Michael. They'd lived together openly for years, though Pennsylvania still didn't recognize their relationship legally. Helen wondered if Daniel had found peace, if he'd made a life that felt authentic. Then, in the summer of 2020, Helen received a letter. The return address was Philadelphia. Inside was a handwritten note from Michael. He wrote that Daniel had died of COVID-19 in April. He wrote that Daniel had carried guilt about Helen for his entire life. In one of his last coherent moments, Michael wrote, "Daniel asked me to contact you. He wanted you to know he was sorry. He wanted you to know that you deserved better than what he gave you." Enclosed with the letter was a check for $50,000. Daniel's portion of life insurance, Michael explained. He wanted you to have it. He said it could never repay what he took from you, but he hoped it might help. Helen sat in her living room, the one she'd shared with Richard, filled with their books and photographs and memories, and held Daniel's final apology. She thought about the girl she'd been at 26, so full of hope and faith. She thought about the years she'd spent believing she was unlovable. She thought about Richard, who'd loved her fiercely and without reservation. She thought about Daniel, trapped by his time and his fear, hurting others in his desperate attempt to survive. She felt sad for all of them. Sad for Daniel, who'd never gotten to live openly until middle age. Sad for Michael, who'd spent decades loving someone in secret. Sad for herself, for the years stolen, for the innocence lost. But she also felt something else. Gratitude. Because the pain, the deception, the dissolve of her first marriage had led her, eventually, to Richard, to real love, to becoming fully herself. Helen deposited the check and donated it all to an LGBTQ youth center in Philadelphia. In memory of Daniel Carmichael, she wrote on the donation form, May the next generation have the freedom he never did. Now, at 73, Helen sits in her comfortable chair in the house Richard left her. Her children Richards from his first marriage visit regularly with grandchildren who call her Grandma Helen. She volunteers at the library. She tends her garden. She reads poetry. She lives a quiet, full life that is entirely her own. Sometimes, late at night, she still takes out that wedding photo. She looks at that young woman in the ivory dress, so hopeful and naive, and she feels tenderness for her. She wants to tell her that it will hurt God. It will hurt, but that she'll survive. That she'll find real love. That she'll learn her worth isn't determined by whether someone desires her, but by the person she chooses to be when the world tries to break her. She wants to tell her that there's no shame in being deceived. The shame belongs to the deceiver. She wants to tell her that starting over at 30 isn't too late. That the life you build from ruins can be even stronger than the one you dreamed of at 26. She wants to tell her that love, real love, exists. That it's worth waiting for. That it's worth fighting for. And that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you ends up being the thing that saves you, because it forces you to become who you were always meant to be. Helen closes the photo album and turns off the light. Tomorrow, she'll plant tomatoes. She'll call her stepson. She'll live another day of the life she built from the wreckage of her youth. And she'll do it with her head held high, with dignity intact, with the hard-won knowledge that she survived. She rebuilt. She loved again. And that, she thinks as sleep pulls her under, is its own kind of redemption.